Do you think you're safe on the dark streets of the city at night? You're completely wrong. What they never told you about being a garbage collector will change everything you thought you knew about the supernatural. This video will challenge your belief about what is real and what is not. Stay until the end and discover why some mysteries should never be uncovered. The answer is closer than you think, and perhaps you don't want to know. Get ready for the shocking truth. If you dare to look in the dead of night, when the city seems to sleep, there are those who work while everyone else rests. Garbage collectors, men and women who brave the darkness and the silence of the streets, moving through forgotten urban corridors. But for some, this seemingly ordinary routine is about to take a supernatural turn. Reports of strange objects, unexplainable shadows, and experiences beyond human comprehension have begun to emerge. What happens when the city's trash merges with something far more sinister? Michael had always worked at night, navigating the silent, empty streets of the city. The sound of the garbage truck cut through the cold air of the early morning, and the flickering streetlights cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. His routine was repetitive, almost automatic, but that night, the silence felt deeper, like something was waiting to happen. He followed his usual route, stopping at an isolated dumping ground on the outskirts of the city. It was a place he knew well. The air was thick, and the stench of garbage mixed with the dampness of the night, making the street feel utterly abandoned. As he stepped down from the truck, something caught his attention. Among the bags of trash, something was out of place. A small wooden box, dark and worn, as if it had been sitting there for decades. What was strange was that there was nothing else like it nearby. How could a box like this have ended up here, buried among the garbage? Michael moved closer, and as soon as he touched it, a shiver ran down his spine. The wood was cold, as if it had absorbed the chill of the night. A strange sensation crept over him, a pressure building in his chest, as if the very air around him had become heavier. What was this? He knew he shouldn't be touching something like this, but an irresistible curiosity compelled him to open the lid. Inside the box, lying on a piece of dark fabric, was a crumpled piece of paper. He unrolled it, and what he saw made him take a step back. The words were written in an old, irregular script, as if someone had written them in a hurry or with great difficulty. It wasn't in any language he recognized, but there was something familiar about the rhythm of the words, something that made his stomach churn. Trying to make sense of the writing, Michael suddenly heard a sound. A whisper, faint, distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there, coming from the far end of the deserted street. He froze. "Michael?" The voice was soft, almost a gentle calling, but he had no idea where it was coming from. There was no one around. He looked around, scanning the street, but everything was as it had always been. Still, silent, lifeless. He swallowed hard, his heartbeat quickening. His hands trembled as he still held the paper, fear beginning to take hold. The voice grew closer, more distinct, but he still couldn't pinpoint its source. He turned toward the truck, already debating whether he should just leave. But as he looked back, a sudden, chilling realization rooted him in place. Something was watching him, not just now. The feeling was too strong, too persistent, as if it had been watching him the entire time, unseen. When he finally placed the box back into the trash and took a step away, the street felt quieter than ever. The wind, which had been present only moments before, had suddenly vanished. Michael looked ahead, and a strange sense of déjà vu crept over him. Everything seemed exactly as before, yet somehow nothing felt the same. As he climbed into the truck, the coldness still clung to him, and the feeling of being watched refused to fade. He tried to shake it off, to put it behind him, but as he drove, his mind kept circling back to the box, the paper, and most of all, the voice. The street felt darker now, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something move within the shadows. Something that shouldn't have been there. But when he looked again, everything was still. He glanced at the rear-view mirror, trying to convince himself it was all just his imagination. And yet, as the truck rumbled down the empty road, he could swear something had changed. Something was there, watching, waiting, as if it had followed him unseen. Jessica was ahead of schedule, driving through the city's empty streets on her usual night route. The dim glow of the streetlights faintly illuminated the road, casting shadows that danced across the walls of buildings. It was a cold night, and the wind cut through the air with an unsettling chill. The silence of the night had always been comforting to her, but tonight something felt wrong. There were no distant car sounds, no whispers of the wind through the trees, as if the entire city was waiting for something. As she drove down the deserted road, Jessica noticed that the other garbage trucks, which normally followed a similar route, were farther ahead than usual. She glanced at the mirrors, but she couldn't see anyone. The radio was silent, and the sound of the truck's engine, usually familiar and reassuring, felt muffled, as if something was absorbing it. She turned into a narrow, dark alley, where local businesses left their trash for collection. The alley was enclosed by tall, aging walls, making it feel as though time had stopped there decades ago. She parked the truck and stepped out, ready to begin her routine. But the moment her feet touched the pavement, she felt a shift in the air. The wind had stopped abruptly. What had once been a familiar, rhythmic background noise, the hum of the truck, the distant rustling of paper, the occasional distant siren, was now completely gone. The alley felt too still, almost as if it had been drained of sound entirely. Jessica felt a presence, a sensation that something was watching her, as if the darkness itself had come alive. She walked toward the back of the truck, her boots pressing against the pavement. The ground felt strangely cold, much colder than it should have been for that time of year. She scanned the alley, but it was empty, and then she saw them. Footprints, but not just any footprints. Deep, heavy impressions in the dirt and scattered trash, as if something massive had walked through here. They were larger than any human footprint, fresh and strangely spaced apart, as if the thing that made them moved in unnatural strides. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. The footprints led toward the farthest trash bin, but the most disturbing part was that they stopped there. There were no other tracks leading away. It was as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Jessica hesitated, but forced herself to step forward. She reached the bin and lifted the lid. Her breath caught in her throat as the air seemed to thicken around her. Inside, something gleamed under the faint streetlight, a broken bottle, its surface etched with strange symbols. The symbols were not from any language she recognized. They had been carved unevenly, almost as if by an unsteady hand, or something far older, far darker. Around the bottle, a dark, viscous liquid slowly spread across the trash, its color too deep to be just old wine or oil. A sense of nausea twisted in her stomach. It felt wrong, not just dirty or discarded. but as if it held an energy of its own, something she couldn't quite explain. She took a step back, shaking off her growing unease. As she turned to head back to the truck, a presence loomed behind her. A pressure weighed down on her shoulders, heavy, oppressive, like someone was standing right behind her. The alley was still empty, yet she knew she wasn't alone. Jessica slowly looked up at the truck's rearview mirror, her breath hitching. For a brief second, she saw something move. A shadow, large, dark, shifting unnaturally in the dim alleyway. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She whipped her head around. Nothing. The alley was silent again, empty. Jessica took a sharp breath and quickly climbed back into the truck, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. As she drove back toward the main road, an unsettling feeling wouldn't leave her. Each street she turned onto felt darker, the streetlights offering less illumination than before. And that feeling of being followed only grew stronger. She glanced at the mirror again, nothing. The radio remained silent. The streets were deserted. But just as she passed beneath the glow of a street lamp, a chill crawled up her spine. Something was watching her. Something big. Something that couldn't be seen directly. She knew it was there, even if she couldn't see it. As she left the alley behind, one thought haunted her. What if that bottle wasn't just an object? What if it was a warning? Her chest tightened as she drove through the empty streets, the realization settling like a weight inside her. The city was full of secrets, and tonight, she had just stumbled into one that wasn't meant to be found. What had really happened this night? Ethan was starting to get used to working as a garbage collector. Yet, despite the routine, there was something about the silence of the night that unsettled him. It was a dense silence, as if the entire city was holding its breath. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it. Something was always there, just at the edge of his perception. Never close enough for him to understand, but never truly gone. That night, the sky was covered with heavy clouds, blocking out the moonlight. The streets were deserted, and the sound of the garbage truck's engine felt muffled, almost as if it was moving through an invisible fog. It was the same street as always, but somehow it felt different. Colder, quieter. Ethan tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. He glanced at the other garbage trucks, but they were farther away than usual. The radio was silent, which was strange. Normally, they always chatted during their shifts. But tonight, nothing. He turned into a narrow alleyway, a secluded spot where shadows stretched beyond what the eye could see. The streetlights flickered, their glow weak and unsteady, as if they were about to go out. The alley was empty, except for the echo of his own footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. Ethan stepped down from the truck, and immediately, the sensation of being watched crawled over him. The wind had completely stopped. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere was waiting for something. The alley seemed deeper than usual, the darkness at the corners shifting ever so slightly, though there was no wind, no movement. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of something lurking just out of sight gnawed at his nerves. As he picked up the trash bags, a voice, barely a whisper, drifted through his mind. It wasn't a physical sound. It was inside his head. Ethan. It was soft, almost an echo from a distance, but it made his stomach twist. He froze, his breathing suddenly heavy. He turned, scanning the alley, but it was empty. The street was no longer silent. A low, droning hum filled the air, like something vibrating just beneath the surface of reality. But there was no one there. Only him. The whisper came again, clearer now, pressing against his thoughts like a voice slipping into his mind. Ethan, a shiver ran down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Without knowing why, he glanced at the truck's side mirror, and there it was, a shadow moving at the far end of the alley, a shape indistinct and shifting, almost as if the darkness itself was pulling away from it. It didn't make sense. The alley had been empty just moments before. He turned quickly, looking toward where the shadow had been. Nothing, just more darkness. His heartbeat pounded in his chest. Ethan tried to shake it off and hurried toward the truck, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loudly, amplifying the growing sense of imminent danger. He climbed into the truck, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but it felt too quiet, too distant, as if the sound itself was being swallowed by the darkness. He drove forward, his pulse still racing, but the alley behind him felt wrong, as if something unseen had just unfolded there, something that wasn't meant to be noticed. And then the whisper returned. Ethan, but this time it wasn't in his head. It was behind him. He snapped his gaze to the rear-view mirror. Nothing. The street behind him was empty, but the shadow, it was there, farther back, but moving, slowly, purposefully, not human. Not something he could comprehend. His breath hitched. He pressed harder on the gas, the truck rattling as he sped forward. But no matter how fast he went, he could feel it behind him. It was always there, just out of reach, watching, observing. He turned a corner and froze. The road ahead was completely blocked. For a moment, pure panic gripped him. This was a road he knew well. But now, it was smothered in an impossibly thick fog, denser than anything he had ever seen. He couldn't see past it. And then, through the mist, he saw it. The shadow, ahead of him now. Or was it the mist itself? He couldn't tell. But he felt it. It was close, closer than ever before. And it was coming for him. Ethan slammed the gas pedal down, the truck roaring forward, and then nothing. The street was clear again. The fog was gone. The whisper had vanished. But he knew this wasn't over. The silence had returned, but it wasn't normal silence. It was a silence that carried weight. Something had followed him. Something not human, and more terrifying than anything else. Something that knew his name. Mark was one of the most experienced drivers on the garbage collection team, and he knew the night brought many challenges. The streets, usually deserted, became even more eerie as the early hours crept in. He had always liked the job, even though it was lonely, especially during those hours when the only sound was the steady hum of the truck breaking the silence. But that night, something was different. From the beginning of his shift, Mark had noticed that things felt off. He was driving down his usual route, a secondary road leading toward the city center, when he began to notice something strange. Ahead of him, in the distance, there was a flickering light. At first, he thought it was another truck, but as he got closer, he realized the light wasn't moving as it should. It was hovering, almost suspended in the middle of the road, as if waiting for something. Mark tried to ignore it, but as he drove past the light, the sense that something was wrong grew stronger. Then, when he checked the rear-view mirror, he saw something even stranger. There was another truck behind him, But it wasn't like the others on his team. This one looked old, worn down, an outdated model he had never seen before on these streets. He reached for the radio to communicate with the others, but the signal was dead. No response. His heartbeat quickened. He sped up, but the mysterious truck kept pace, following him at a consistent distance. Mark pushed the accelerator, but no matter how fast he went, the truck didn't fall behind. At every turn, at every intersection, the truck was still there, always appearing in his mirror. Panic began to build. What was happening? Minutes passed, and as the road grew more deserted, more isolated, Mark realized he was trapped in a chase with no explanation. He glanced at the mirror again. The strange truck was closer now. Something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. Then absolute terror gripped him. When he looked ahead again, the light in the distance was starting to fade, not moving away, not vanishing like a normal light, but fading unnaturally, as if it was being swallowed by something unseen. He looked back at the rear-view mirror. The truck was gone. The road behind him was empty. Nothing. Just dark, desolate asphalt stretching into nowhere. His heart pounded against his ribs. A cold sweat prickled at his skin. Then he felt it, a presence beside him. Mark turned his head instinctively. Nothing. No truck. No one there. The night air pressed down on him, thick, suffocating. The world felt too quiet. A silence that didn't belong, as if the universe itself had momentarily stopped. He slowed the truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a brief moment, he considered stopping, stepping out, trying to understand what was happening. But something held him back. It was a gut feeling, an undeniable certainty that if he stepped out, he wouldn't find the world as he knew it anymore. He turned his eyes back to the road ahead, and there it was, the light again, the same flickering light he had seen at the beginning of his route. But now, something was wrong. This wasn't a normal light. It wasn't a vehicle, wasn't a reflection. It was cold, lifeless, a distant, threatening presence. Mark hesitated for a moment. Then he drove toward it. As he approached, the road around him began to change. The once familiar streets twisted, and suddenly, the world around him felt empty. The street he had driven 100 times before was now a hollow void, stretching infinitely, with no signs of life, no city, no past, no future. The shadows stretched unnaturally, longer than they should have, as if reaching for something, and then the light vanished, and in its place, only darkness. Mark looked around, his breath shaking. For the first time, he realized the mysterious truck was no longer behind him. He was alone, on a road that no longer existed, in a place that didn't make sense. He had been trapped, looped into a road that would never lead anywhere again. What had happened to him? What was that phantom truck that had never stopped following him? And, more terrifyingly, why was he now completely alone in a world that had disappeared? David had always been a practical man, a garbage truck driver for over 10 years. He knew every street in the city like the back of his hand. The routine of working at night, while the city slept, had always brought him a sense of peace. The silence of the empty streets, the faint flicker of streetlights, the monotonous hum of the truck's engine, it all felt familiar, comforting. But that night, the air was different. Something felt wrong. He started his shift, driving through the narrow, dimly lit streets of the city. The cold night breeze slipped through the truck's windows, and the stillness around him felt unnaturally deep. As he passed through an isolated neighborhood, David noticed something unsettling. The sound of the engine was strange, more muted than usual. It was as if the sound itself was being swallowed by the darkness. He looked toward the other garbage trucks, but they were farther ahead than usual. He reached for the radio to check in, but the signal was dead. The discomfort grew. Something in the air was pressing against him, a weight he couldn't ignore. The city at night had always had an eerie energy, something David could never quite explain. But tonight, it was stronger than ever. He approached a narrow alleyway, where the streets tightened even more, the buildings on either side looming like dark silhouettes. The stench of trash mixed with the icy night air, filling his lungs. As he stepped out, his footsteps echoed against the alley walls. And then he saw it, a wooden box. It wasn't discarded like the other piles of garbage. It was separate, as if waiting for him. The wood was aged, worn, covered in the scars of time. But the moment he touched it, a sharp chill ran through his fingertips. It wasn't just the cold of the night. This was something else. Something unnatural. David hesitated, but his curiosity overpowered his unease. He opened the box. Inside, there was a crumpled piece of paper, its edges torn and stained, as if it had been left there for years. He unfolded it, and his stomach twisted. The words were written in an uneven, frantic scrawl, as if the person who wrote them had been in a desperate hurry. It wasn't a language David recognized, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just foreign, it was unsettling. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and then he felt it. He was no longer alone. The air thickened. The darkness shifted. Something was watching him. The shadows around him were closing in. David's breath hitched as he scanned the alley, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. But there was nothing there, only the crushing silence. With his mind racing, David shut the box, shoving it back among the garbage bags. He climbed into the truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The silence was deafening now. He looked at the rear-view mirrors. Nothing. No movement. No lights. But he could feel it. Something was following him. He accelerated, trying to shake the feeling. But then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The sound echoed behind him, keeping pace with the truck. He glanced at the mirrors again. Nothing. The alley was empty. He pressed the accelerator harder, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the footsteps continued, louder, closer. Then he saw it. In the mirror, a figure, not human. Something twisted, a shadow shifting unnaturally along the streets. His chest tightened. He slammed his foot on the gas, the truck roaring forward. But no matter how fast he went, it followed, always there, always watching, waiting. Every time he turned a corner, the figure would disappear, only to reappear again, lurking in the dark. His panic mounted. He no longer knew where he was. The city had changed. The streets, twisted unfamiliar. The roads that once felt like home had become a labyrinth of darkness. And the shadow, it was closer now. No longer just a presence, but something with form. Something inhuman. David tried to brake, but the truck wouldn't stop. The engine growled, but it was no longer under his control. He looked into the mirror. The shadow was there. It was no longer a formless mass. It was a figure a human shape, but horribly distorted. Its eyes locked onto him, but there was no face. Only darkness where its features should have been. It was reaching for him. David's breath caught in his throat. He knew there was no escape. The city had trapped him. The truck surged forward, faster, uncontrollable. The streets twisted around him, morphing into a nightmare. The figure was beside him now, just an arm's reach away. His fear consumed him. But deep down he knew the truth. He had been caught in something beyond his understanding, something he could never escape. And now he was trapped in the cycle, a road that would never lead him back. James, a veteran garbage truck driver, had always known that the city streets at night held something strange. But he never believed the stories the other drivers told, until that night. It was his last shift of the month, the longest and most exhausting of them all, when he found himself in a sector he had always dreaded. An old, poorly lit neighborhood where the houses were abandoned and crumbling. The kind of place no one wanted to be after dark. As he drove through the narrow alley, a sense of claustrophobia crept over him. The streets were so tight that he could barely maneuver the truck between the decaying buildings. He glanced around and saw broken windows, collapsed doors, and even shadows that seemed to shift, though he knew no one lived there anymore. The alley was completely deserted, except for the distant hum of the truck's engine and the glow of the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. The pressure in the air was unusual. The shadows felt heavier, and the alley seemed endless, stretching on indefinitely. James stopped at several trash collection points, throwing bags into the truck's compactor. But something felt off. Time felt slower. The shadows around him, they weren't just still. They were moving, shifting at the edges of his vision. He felt eyes on him, but no matter where he looked, he saw nothing. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. Then, as he stepped back into the truck, he heard it, a whisper, low, drawn out, right next to his ear. James froze. He turned quickly, scanning the alley. Nothing. The air was dead, with no wind to stir the debris at his feet. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, and this time he understood the words. Leave, don't look back. His chest tightened. The instinct to run battled against the paralysis of pure terror. He climbed into the truck, forcing his hands onto the steering wheel. He turned the key. Nothing. The truck wouldn't start. He turned it again, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The engine stuttered, but the truck refused to move. Then he saw it, not in front of him, but in the rear-view mirrors. A figure, moving between the shadows. It wasn't human. It had the outline of a person, but its body was distorted, flickering between something real and unreal. The thing didn't walk. It glided, its form bending unnaturally, like it was halfway between two worlds. James tried the key again, desperation creeping into his trembling hands. The truck remained still, as if something was holding it in place. He glanced at the mirrors again. The figure was closer now. The shadows around it deepened, thickened, swallowing the dim alley lights. James felt something pressing against him, a weight that made it hard to breathe. The fear was crushing him. Then he looked again. It was right behind him, just outside the truck window. A faceless entity, black as void, shifting like a shadow detached from reality. James could feel it breathing through the glass. But it wasn't human breath. It was wrong. A distorted, hollow sound, as if it was feeding off the air itself. He grabbed the door handle. Locked. He slammed his fist against the door, his pulse thundering in his skull. The entity was closer now, its presence crushing, suffocating. Then a stench filled the truck. Rot, decay, something ancient, something dead. James' mind screamed at him to escape, but his body wouldn't obey. His breath was shallow. He glanced at the mirror one last time, and saw a city that no longer existed. The buildings were ruins, collapsed skeletons of a world long abandoned. The streets were narrower, twisting like a labyrinth of forgotten places. The shadows moved at the edges, alive, shifting with a mind of their own. James realized he wasn't in the city anymore, not the city he knew. He had somehow crossed over into a place where the rules of time and space didn't apply. And the entity, it was beside him now. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were holes in reality, consuming light, consuming everything around them. James tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was gone, his mind fractured. He was trapped in an endless alley, in a cycle he could never escape. And then, the last thing he heard, a laugh, soft, distant, from the shadows. And then, everything went black. Daniel was on his way to one of his final stops for the night, as a garbage truck driver. He was used to the silence of the early hours, but something about that night felt different. The sound of the engine echoed through the empty streets in a way he couldn't explain. He glanced at the rear-view mirrors. There was no one. The city seemed even more deserted than usual. Not a single car in sight. Not even the nocturnal animals made a sound. It was as if everything had fallen into a deep, heavy sleep. He was approaching an old neighborhood, a place where the houses stood in ruins and the poorly lit streets looked frozen in time, untouched for decades. It wasn't the first time he had driven through there, but tonight, the district seemed darker, as if it were closing itself off from the outside world. He stopped the truck on what seemed like an endless street and stepped out to collect the trash. And that's when he heard the sound for the first time, a faint click, like something shifting in the shadows. He froze, scanning his surroundings. Nothing. The houses were empty, their broken windows staring lifelessly at the streets. It looked deserted, abandoned, almost hollow. But the sound continued, a movement, something approaching. He hurried to gather the trash bags, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that he was being watched. Then he checked the truck's mirrors, and what he saw sent a chill through his entire body. A shadow, something dark, indistinct, moving rapidly between the buildings. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it was still there, and it didn't look natural. It was shifting, warping, as if it wasn't something human at all. Daniel told himself he was just tired, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he moved away from the collection point, the sounds behind him grew closer. And when he checked the mirrors again, he saw the figure once more. This time closer. It wasn't a person. It was a shape floating, appearing and disappearing at random intervals. He pressed down on the accelerator, but the shadow kept following, always maintaining its unnerving distance, never falling behind. The streets narrowed, and a suffocating sensation crept over him. It was as if he was being herded into a trap. Every turn he made, the shadow drew closer. He scanned his surroundings, nothing. It was as if the entire city had vanished, leaving only him and whatever was following him. The anxiety grew. The panic settled in. He no longer knew what was happening. The silence was crushing. Then he looked at the mirror one last time, and the shadow was now right behind the truck, floating, waiting, watching. His breath hitched. He slammed the gas pedal down, desperate to escape. But then the shadow moved ahead of him, blocking the road. Impossible. He hit the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. The wheel locked. The pedals wouldn't respond. The truck was moving forward. On its own. Daniel's stomach twisted. Something was controlling the vehicle. He checked the mirrors again, his heart pounding violently in his chest. And this time, he finally saw what had been following him. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a creature, formless, yet almost human, a thing that merged with the darkness, shifting, consuming everything around it. And its eyes, they were glowing, not with light, but with a cold, hollow presence. They weren't looking at him. They were looking through him, straight into his soul. He tried to escape, but his legs refused to move. It wasn't just fear. Something was holding him in place. The creature drifted closer, silent but inevitable. He knew there was no escape. He was trapped in a street that led nowhere, surrounded by shadows that had come to claim him. He forced his body to move, breaking free from his paralysis. Jumping out of the truck, he ran into the darkness, only to find nothing. The street was empty again. No shadow, no footsteps, no sound, but the fear remained. He was alone, lost in a nightmare he would never understand. Eric was on his way to one of his final stops for the night. As a garbage truck driver, he was used to the silence of the early hours, but something about that night felt different. The sound of the engine echoed through the empty streets in a way he couldn't explain. He glanced at the rear-view mirrors. There was no one. The city seemed even more deserted than usual. Not a single car in sight. Not even the nocturnal animals made a sound. It was as if everything had fallen into a deep, heavy sleep. He was approaching an old neighborhood, a place where the houses stood in ruins and the poorly lit streets looked frozen in time, untouched for decades. It wasn't the first time he had driven through there, but tonight, the district seemed darker, as if it were closing itself off from the outside world. He stopped the truck on what seemed like an endless street and stepped out to collect the trash. And that's when he heard the sound for the first time, a faint click, like something shifting in the shadows. He froze, scanning his surroundings. Nothing. The houses were empty, their broken windows staring lifelessly at the streets. It looked deserted, abandoned, almost hollow. But the sound continued, a movement, something approaching. He hurried to gather the trash bags, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that he was being watched. Then he checked the truck's mirrors, and what he saw sent a chill through his entire body. A shadow, something dark, indistinct, moving rapidly between the buildings. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it was still there, and it didn't look natural. It was shifting, warping, as if it wasn't something human at all. Eric told himself he was just tired, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he moved away from the collection point, the sounds behind him grew closer, and when he checked the mirrors again, he saw the figure once more. This time closer. It wasn't a person. It was a shape floating, appearing and disappearing at random intervals. He pressed down on the accelerator, but the shadow kept following, always maintaining its unnerving distance, never falling behind. The streets narrowed, and a suffocating sensation crept over him. It was as if he was being herded into a trap. Every turn he made, the shadow drew closer. He scanned his surroundings, nothing. It was as if the entire city had vanished, leaving only him and whatever was following him. The anxiety grew. The panic settled in. He no longer knew what was happening. The silence was crushing. Then he looked at the mirror one last time, and the shadow was now right behind the truck, floating, waiting, watching. His breath hitched. He slammed the gas pedal down, desperate to escape, but then the shadow moved ahead of him, blocking the road. Impossible. He hit the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. The wheel locked. The pedals wouldn't respond. The truck was moving forward on its own. Eric's stomach twisted. Something was controlling the vehicle. He checked the mirrors again, his heart pounding violently in his chest. And this time, he finally saw what had been following him. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a creature, formless, yet almost human. A thing that merged with the darkness, shifting, consuming everything around it. And its eyes, they were glowing, not with light, but with a cold, hollow presence. They weren't looking at him. They were looking through him, straight into his soul. He tried to escape, but his legs refused to move. It wasn't just fear. Something was holding him in place. The creature drifted closer, silent but inevitable. He knew there was no escape. He was trapped in a street that led nowhere, surrounded by shadows that had come to claim him. He forced his body to move, breaking free from his paralysis. Jumping out of the truck, he ran into the darkness, only to find nothing. The street was empty again. No shadow, no footsteps, no sound, but the fear remained. He was alone, lost in a nightmare he would never understand. But the real question is, what happened to Eric? Did he truly become lost in an endless alley, or did the mysterious key he found open a door to another reality? Something beyond his comprehension? And more importantly, was he chosen to become part of something greater, something that exists beyond our perception of the world? As you ponder this, I ask you, what would you do if you found a key like Eric's? And if, as you followed your usual path, you came across something that could not be explained, something that defies logic and reason, how would you react? Would you keep trying to escape? Or would you be drawn to the mystery, unable to resist the pull of the unknown? Leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened to him? And perhaps the bigger question is, are we all just waiting for the right moment to discover what lies beyond what we see?